Hey everyone, as part of my A to Z sewing techniques series, today I will be showing you how to do a Hong Kong finish. Just like with French seams that I taught you a couple weeks ago, this is another great way to finish off the inside of something that we want to look a little bit more expensive and well made, but we don't necessarily want to put a lining into. I've seen this method used the most in unstructured blazers and jackets, and one of my favorite ways that a lot of companies add a little bit of extra interest to these otherwise fairly boring garments is to cut this bias in a contrasting color or a fun print. Okay, so our first step is to sew our seam. Now you want to be sure that you are doing this on a seam that has at least a 1/2 inch seam allowance or larger. Now to cut out our bias, we're going to measure either the seam on our pattern or the seam on our garment, and we're going to add a couple inches to that. And then you're going to cut the width of your bias either 1.25 inches or 1.5 inches. 1.5 inches is easier for a beginner, but just be aware that you will have to probably trim off that extra 1/4 inch at the end. Once your bias is cut, we're going to take that strip and we're going to put raw edge of the bias to the raw edge of one side of our seam allowance. And we're going to pin that, making sure that we aren't stretching our bias at all, and we're keeping it at that 1.5 or 1.25 inch width that we cut it at. And this is going to give you the prettiest wrap whenever it's all sewn up. Once we've stitched down our bias strip, we're going to press the seam allowance away from the finished seam. And this is going to give us a really clean, crisp edge where we just stitched at. When you're done pressing, go ahead and wrap the rest of your bias around to the underside and pin it in place. Once you're satisfied with how your bias strip is laying on your seam allowance, we can take it over to the sewing machine and stitch in the ditch directly on that line that we first sewed. Now we can repeat all those steps on the other side of the seam allowance. Once you're done sewing, give both sides a good press, and this is what your finished seam is going to look like when you're all done. Now, if you have a little too much fabric on the underneath side, go ahead and trim that excess off as close to the stitch line as you can. And don't worry about the fraying, because we cut these strips on bias. One of the benefits of cutting on the bias is that it's not going to fray the same way as if we were to have cut these strips on the straight of grain. Okay guys, if you like this video, hit that like button, and if you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we have way more videos left in this sewing techniques series.